Thank you very much, and also thank you very much, Jason, for your eloquent story. I think we agree on quite a lot, and that is that the current economic growth is not future-proof, that GDP, as the way we measure economic growth at this point in time, has many flaws. But where we, I think, don't agree is how we get there. And where Jason Hickel is actually, aiming at degrowth, post-growth, whatever you want to call it. I very much believe in green growth, I admit. I wrote a book on it, so that's what I did. Degrowth may sound logical to some, because the economy has already crossed or is close to crossing several ecological boundaries. But to others, especially those with less income, especially those with less income or with less opportunity, degrowth sounds, well, at least strange, but also frightening a bit to them. And that wealthy or privileged people consume less is to be encouraged. But can the same be asked of people who are less privileged, who are more vulnerable? And for me, economic growth or degrowth or post-growth, whatever you want to call it, is not an end in itself. For me, green growth is a means. If we want future generations, if we want vulnerable households to be able to live at the same level of welfare, well-being, happiness, whatever you want to call it, as we currently do, then we will simply need economic growth measured in a different way than we do it right now. So when we talk about growth, it's also very important to define it. And for me, economic growth is not GDP as we currently know it. I will give you 3 reasons why economic growth is necessary. In the book, I have more reasons, but now, because of time, I will give you 3. Growth makes the cost of aging affordable, and many of the countries living in the global, of the countries in the global north that, according to Jason Hickel, should go into degrowth, post-growth, are actually aging communities, and that is enormously costly in the way we've structured it right now. Because without growth, spending on what we call in the Netherlands AOW, state pension benefits, or healthcare, that crowds out other government spending that is equally important for people's well-being. And the second reason, as long as we pay for those other very important things like the public services, the semi-public services like education, defense, healthcare, justice, and we pay for those from public funds. And how are those public funds funded? Well, they are funded from taxes paid to the government by businesses, by people on the labor market working, and so on. So economic growth is needed to actually have more spending capacity to invest in those very important semi and public services. These services are essential for high life satisfactions and equal opportunities, and that is a second reason. The third reason I would like to put on the table here is that growth is also needed to enable for income or wealth redistribution from rich to poor, from privileged to underprivileged, and so on. And that is not because we need a belastingdienst, because we need a tax administration, but it is because taxation has a cost in itself, because it influences the way people and firms behave. If you have a high marginal tax rate on income, labor income, then people start to reduce their working hours. If there is a high marginal rate on profits, then firms will start to invest less in, for instance, greening their portfolio. And so these costs of taxations are quite substantial. And the fallacy, I think, of anti-growth thinkers or degrowth thinkers is that they neglect the fact that taxpayers' money is actually needed to pay for much of what we all want, and that they also advocate, but they need taxpayers' money to do that. And you need economic growth to generate additional tax revenue. And as you, as politicians, very well know in this political arena, what you're talking about is the extra money in the tax funds that is available for doing new things, because the rest that was already in the schatkist, in the public funds, has already been distributed, has already been allocated to many of the other things like education, defense, and so on. If you want to invest more in higher quality or accessibility of public services, you need growth to have more public funds to do that. Without growth, there is little to redistribute. There is little to improve the quality of education, little to keep healthcare accessible, or little to correct the state pension, the AOW, for inflation. Well, the reason I wrote a book on green growth is that such growth is necessary to also maintain social cohesion and combat polarization, something that is also very much part of the political arena that you are working so courageously, full of courage in. And these are essentials, I think, preconditions, social cohesion, trust in the political politics for greening society and the economy. And let me clarify this because it's quite important. Without economic growth, it is not possible, I think, to make those who are the most vulnerable, who depend on government redistribution and taxpayer-funded benefits and public goods like healthcare, education, and housing, feel that they will not foot the bill for climate policy, for energy transition, for greening the economy. And if they don't have access to these CMI or public services, if they don't feel included in the redistribution of wealth, they will not support greening. And we already see that today. The climate policies, the energy transition is already part of all the polarization. And without growth, the accessibility of the public goods, the redistribution of wealth is not possible to a sufficient extent to make them feel included, to combat polarization. And it is my contention that with growth, the economy, that without growth, the economy cannot go green, but will actually perish due to polarization and mistrust. So I think economic growth is needed not as a goal, but as a means to green the economy. And although economic growth is needed, and I fully agree with Jason Hickel that the current economic growth is absolutely not adequate, it's not future-proof, and we need a different kind of economic growth, but I call this still growth. And I will give you 3 reasons why I think that GDP is not adequate and how we can change it but still keep growing. The first is that GDP is a measure that, that only measures the volume but not the distribution of wealth. And income distribution has been fairly equal and stable in the Netherlands for decades now, but wealth distribution has been hugely unequal. And at the same time, this also applies, this inequality, to opportunities. Yesterday there was this report of the Social Cultural Planning Bureau in the Netherlands, and it showed again that there is a persistent gap between privileged and the underprivileged. Again, if you want to green the economy, given that gap, you need growth. Because people at the underprivileged side of the gap will not trust any other outcome, I think. Then the second reason I think that GDP is flawed, is outdated, is that it only measures what is traded in a market and is priced in a market. We economists call that externalities. What is not internal in the market is actually external to that and doesn't count, but still has lots of value to all of us. think of environmental effects like the degradation of biodiversity, but there are many other examples, like the benefit of preventative health care or informal care is also outside of GDP. Voluntary work, informal care, completely excluded from GDP. And I think that by expanding GDP, by internalizing those external effects into GDP, you also have growth. And that is green growth. So by putting a carbon tax or a nitrogen tax or a biodiversity levy on those ecological disasters or emissions, there you can also expand GDP in a way that it's actually green growth. Or if you introduce a combined sugar, fat and salt tax, then you can boost preventative health care. And if you use the revenues from those taxes, be it a carbon tax or a salt tax or whatever, and use those revenues to actually decrease the marginal tax rates for lower and middle income households, then you also make it something that they can actually handle, that they feel that they were still included in the redistribution mechanisms in the political arena. Another thing is a negative income tax would, I think, be a very effective means to compensate for voluntary work without the disadvantages of a basic income. That basic income is, I think, as an economist, far too expensive, because then everyone, including wealthier households, would be entitled to it. And with it, the negative income, that only compensates for unpaid work provided by those households below a certain income threshold that would still have to be determined, of course. Then a third reason that we need other economic growth is that current growth does not automatically mean that households' freely disposable income grows along with GDP. So the country gets richer, but households don't see that in their own freely disposable income positions. That is because a large part of the income is not freely disposable. It is so people are must be compulsory spent on taxes, pension savings, health insurance premiums, and so on. So there is a gap between being a rich country measured in terms of GDP per capita, and on the other hand, the freely disposable income per capita. And there you see this gap. And again, this gap, as of the start of this century, is increasing. And it makes people mistrust what's happening here, because, hey, we're getting richer in terms of GDP, but I'm not feeling richer whatsoever. So we need to close this gap. And again, green growth can help to do that. I will finish because I see your points, your hand on the mic. Well, to date, and this is my point, we have never even tried green growth. We have never put the incentives where they need to be. There is no carbon tax. There is no nitrogen tax. There is no standard setting where pricing is not possible. We have not even put the system under enough green pressure, if you want to put it like this. So, and yes, I'm sorry to say that also applies to the Dutch government, so courage is indeed needed. And so we have no idea about the transformative, creative or innovative power of an economy to go green. We haven't seen nothing yet, I think, because we simply never tried it. So is green growth possible? I don't know for sure. Because we've never seriously tried it. But I do know for sure is that degrowth, post-growth, will not work, because it will pull away the support for greening with those people who need economic growth, because tax funds come from that, and investments in the things, the semi-public services, and the public benefits that come from that are so important for them. So they need growth in that perspective, but a different kind of growth. So instead of renouncing economic growth and going for the degrowth, let's opt for green growth, I would say. Although there's no certainty that degrowth, because also degrowth, we don't know. We saw that in the COVID crisis. There we had 1 year where we could look, well, what does it do? Well, Degrowth doesn't lead to greening, I think, also, because then you lack the funds that you need to invest in greening. And it's not without reason that there is no democratic country that voluntarily adopts a degrowth agenda. And it all has to do with the social part of it, the social cohesion and so on. So therefore my plea for growth, but then green growth, not as a goal, but as a means. That I want to finish.
Thank you.